Hi everyone, hope you're having a great Thursday so far. My name is Sarah Fairclough and I'm the Business Administrator for our Platform Solutions team here at SmartSimple. Today, we're going to be talking to you more about learning how to manage your security matrices. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get into the presentation. We are going to be sending out a recording of the webinar within a week, so just keep a lookout in your inbox for that. And as well, we are going to be having a Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to post questions throughout. Greg just won't be answering them until after the presentation. And now I'll pass it over to my host, Greg.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy at home. Today we're going to be talking about the security matrices and the various different ones that could be configured throughout SmartSimple. And what the security matrices are, I like to refer to them as kind of the first line of defense and first kind of line of security permissions when we're talking about company records, user records, and individual records within different UTAs. We're going to look at each of those individually, and then at the end we'll also talk briefly about the field security matrices. The purpose of these kind of demonstrations is really to give you an overview of the feature and how some examples of how they're configured. We won't go into deep configuration details, but I will touch on a few bits and pieces as we're going through. What's the main benefit of this kind of configuration tool? It really allows system administrators top-level control over records. And all of this will become clearer as we go. So a typical problem that users within SmartSimple have, or that system administrators have within SmartSimple, is how do we allow different users with different roles to interact with different records? So maybe we have a system administrator, for example, who needs control of everything. Very different to what a typical organization contact, an applicant, or a reviewer would need. So what the security matrix does is it defines a top level of security, a kind of a baseline of security. And then we combine that with other security measures like status-based permissions, type-based permissions, and field-based permissions to combine and leverage all of the power, the security power that SmartSimple offers. Some examples of kind of basic roles that I just touched on there. We're going to look at these because I think they give a nice example of kind of typical scenarios. So as I said, system administrators would have full control. Staff members might have full control, but we restrict the ability to delete certain records. Applicants and reviewers would have limited edit permissions. And then if we think about board members and meeting participants, they should only really be allowed to view individual records that they've been assigned or you know, that they're responsible for. Now, obviously, in your systems, the amount of roles and the amount of access that you're giving your users will vary. Some of our older systems may not have the security matrix configured, but rest assured that it can be configured at this stage. And there are no real concerns if it isn't configured, as long as the main security permissions are enabled. The real benefits of the security matrices: it offers extended control over how and when users can interact with records. And really, it's a simple and powerful tool to control the top level of security. So at this point, I'm going to run through a demo of the feature. And we're going to start with the organization and user security matrices. So these are found within the global settings of your instance. And they're found underneath the security tab. And before you can actually configure them, you need to enable the option here. So we need to enable the organization and user security matrix. And what we're looking at here is how the different roles on the left-hand side can interact with different organizations. So if we take my system administrator role here, we're looking at how the system administrator can interact with organizations within the hierarchy within SmartSimple, and also how the system administrator can interact with different categories of organizations. Just before I forget, the green icons here mean that the security matrix has been checked for those user roles. If the role does not have the security matrix checked, it means that those users will not have any access to those particular record types. And they will be shown a system administrator error or a an error message to contact the system administrator. So if we take the top level here, the hierarchy permissions for the system administrator role, we have a combination of different checkbox and column options here. Depending on what's checked, we obviously get different permissions and different access to the different record types. So in this particular scenario, my system administrator can view, edit, add new records, delete all records, and also look up all organizations within the SmartSimple system. If we were to uncheck the edit option, for example, it now means that they can view, they can create new records, they can delete records, and they can look up existing records, but they cannot modify anything. Likewise, if we were to remove add, the permissions remain the same. They can view and edit any existing records, but they can't add any new ones. Disabling delete is pretty self-explanatory. These users, the system administrator, can no longer delete records. And the lookup checkbox here, this refers to any particular lookup field within the configuration of the system. So if we imagine on a level 1, we would have an organization assigned to the record, and we would also have an applicant or a user assigned to the record. And it's those lookup fields that this box is allowing the user to interact with. So if this is unchecked, my system administrator role would not be able to look up any organizations within those lookup boxes on those records. The category permission below, similar to the hierarchy permission, this is simply advising us how the system administrator can interact with different categories of organizations. So in this particular scenario, we have 2 categories configured. We have grant-seeking organizations, which is a placeholder for all organizations. And then we also have individuals who are not related to any one particular organization. If we imagine, for example, that we had an education category, or we had a non-profit category, or we have churches or religious organizations categories, maybe you have different staff members that are responsible for those different categories of organization. So maybe you have a different role. Maybe you have an education responsible person who's assigned the education role, that they only get the ability to view and edit organizations within the education category. But maybe you give them view permissions for all categories, for example. And we'll see as we go and have a look at some of the staff, the other staff roles, how we could configure that. But it basically allows us to stop, point blank access to organizations that fall into those different categories. Now, we've touched on the positive options here. Let's talk about the negative ones. Anytime a negative option is configured or checked within any of the security matrices, it will trump any other positive or any positive option that's configured where there could be a conflict. For example, if we have the ability here to view, edit, add, delete, and look up all organizations, but I was to explicitly deny grant-seeking organizations, this would mean that my system administrator can now view, add, delete, and look up organizations, but they cannot edit anything within the grant-seeking organization category. Likewise, if we were to deny view down here, this again would trump the view that has been checked up here in the all organizations in the hierarchy. So if now this deny view is checked, my system administrator would not be able to view anything within the grant-seeking organization category. And the same is true for the lookup and the delete options as well. One nice little feature that we have here, if you are allowing an option for one particular row, if we were to click deny view or deny edit, it will automatically uncheck the view and the corresponding view and edit options. So you can't accidentally enable or overwrite permissions that you've already set. So now if we go down and we look at the staff role, you'll notice that they have similar access. So again, we can view, edit, and add, and look up all different records within the organizations, within the organization records, but we are unable to delete any of them. And the same would apply if we imagine that this particular user was only responsible for grant-seeking organization categories. We could change the configuration so that they can view all organizations, but they can only modify what they are responsible for. Now, if we look at a typical example of a user, an end user, an applicant, the configuration is completely different. So from a hierarchy perspective, all we're allowing the applicant or organization contact to do is view and edit their own profile. They can't interact with any other organization record within the system whatsoever. We don't necessarily have to flag it as deny unless you explicitly wanted to. So the ability to view and edit their own organization is enough. They wouldn't be able to access any other organizations within the system. And the same is true for the category permissions down the bottom here. We don't explicitly have to check the category that their organization belongs to. We can simply leave it blank like this, or configured like this. For example, the applicant had sub-organizations, if we imagine maybe universities and university campuses, where they could have different building locations all under the same umbrella organization. Maybe we would want to check the view option here, and that would allow them to view the sub-organizations within their own organization. We mightn't necessarily want them to be able to edit that record because maybe that responsibility would lie with somebody else. But you know, this is a nice simple configuration of that. Just like with all of the other roles, the deny options can be configured. So if, for example, we want to explicitly deny view, deny edit on everything, it's not bad procedure to do that, because it is, again, a nuclear option. It'll allow them to view and edit only their own organizations, and by explicitly denying these roles or these sub-organizations, it means they can't interact with them whatsoever. And the last role I wanted to show from the organization perspective is the role of a reviewer. So in this case, all we've done is we configured the reviewer to only be able to view their organization. Again, there could be somebody else dedicated, responsible to modify the organization. Or maybe in your own scenarios, you don't allow organizations or applicants to change or modify the organizational information at all. Maybe that all has to be directed and go through you. So that's completely fine as well. That's really up to yourselves and your own business processes. But this is, again, a simple example of how a user who should be allowed to view their organization, but not modify anything at all. And then, we're looking at meeting participants here and board members. In these cases, those users would not have any access to the organization hierarchy whatsoever. They would not be able to interact with any of those records. I'm going to proceed now to the user security matrix, and this is a similar layout, similar configuration. And this explains how different user roles interact with, again, the hierarchy, so different users in the hierarchy, and also different user roles. So for the system administrator, again, we have the same configuration as we did previously. They can view, edit, add, delete, lookup all users under all organizations. And then from the roles perspective, they can view, edit, delete, and look up everybody as well. The staff particular role, that's the internal foundation staff, configured in much the same way. They have view, edit, add, and lookup without the delete permissions here. Now, if we take the example, again, maybe we have a particular staff member who's responsible for managing board members and meetings. So maybe we allow them to view and edit all users within the board member role. And likewise, all users, they can view and edit those users within the meeting participant role. But we don't need to explicitly say, or we don't want to give them permission to anything else. So maybe we uncheck the view and the edit, and now users can only search and look up. So staff users could only search and look up users that are in the board member role or the meeting participant role. If we were looking up, this is how that would be configured. And I think at this point, it's important to point out that if we don't allow a user access to the different categories here, on the main organization and user list views, they will not have that category available to them in the dropdown. So when you're configuring your list views or you're interacting with your list views, you need to keep that in mind. If a category isn't visible for a particular user role, it's probably because they don't have access to that particular category in the security matrix in some way. The organization contact role as well is configured, again, with some limited access. We've configured this so that the applicant can view all users under their own organization. They can view and add and look up those users. So if we imagine they want to invite co-applicants to an application, or likewise, again, my university example, they want to collaborate with individuals from different campuses in the same university, we're allowing them to view, add, and look up those users so that they can be added to records as appropriate. But we're only giving them edit permissions to their own profile. So once they've added a profile, they can make the initial, configuration or the initial addition of the record, but they can't modify it after that point. That would be up to the individual. And again, we're not giving them permission to interact with any other roles outside of the hierarchy. And the reviewer is even less again. In this case, they can only view and edit their own user profile. They're unable to modify or interact with any users of any other role or view any other user profiles. Again, just like with the organization, they would get an error message that would advise them to contact their system administrator. So at this point, we're going to leave the organization and user security matrices, and we're going to look at the UTA security matrices. So each individual UTA will have a security matrix, application managers, program managers, meeting managers, budget managers, what have you, whatever is configured in your system. You will have a corresponding security matrix. They are, again, very, very powerful. It acts as a top level of permissions to stop users accessing records that they shouldn't have access to. And it's configured in much the same way. So again, we toggle the security matrix on, and then we also have to give access to the specific roles that we want to display. So in this case, we'll see options for the organization contact, reviewer, staff, and system administrators within the security matrix here, as well as any UTA roles that have been configured. Before we go into the security matrix, we have these other toggles that are also available. And this will, this particular option here can be used to trump the level 1 security matrix, or sorry, this level 2 security matrix, and I think it'll become clearer when I log into it here. So if we think of co-applicants, let's say, where collaboration is required across reports and any kind of milestone deliverables or that, we can use the permissions that have been defined for that particular role on the level 1 application and trickle that down to the level 2. So it means that users don't have to be assigned to every individual record. Now, again, as with a lot of the security matrix configuration, it is a nuclear option. So some severe, or detailed testing would need to be done before actually enabling this. Typically, we would only use the security matrix without this checked, but it's, I just wanted to highlight it before we proceed. As with the organization and user matrix, they're organized in much the same way, split into the different levels. So we have our application level 1, our activity level 2, and if we had them configured, the sub-activity level 3s. So they need to be configured for each different level. And bear in mind that this will apply to every type of record. So, if you have an education grant, an environmental grant, a community support grant, this will be applied to all of those. Now you can narrow down the permissions at a type specific level. So you can restrict access if we think of payments. You don't want an applicant to see payments, so you wouldn't give them access at the type specific configuration. But because they have to interact with maybe progress reports or interim reports or final reports, they would need top level access to the level 2 activities. I hope that makes sense, but please, if it's unclear, be sure to ask me any questions at the end. So we'll start with the organization contact role again. Here we have basically the different access that can be defined. So an organization contact in this case can add all records. So regardless of if they're the owner or if they're assigned or if they're in the person role, the assigned person role, or if they're in the organization, they can always add new records. And this is a typical configuration because if we think about it, unless you're inviting applicants and creating records for them on their behalf, if you have an open call or open program cycles, they will always need to initiate the application themselves. So that is why we give them the ability to add level 1 applications. However, we only allow them to view and edit applications that they are the explicit owner of. When we talk about the owner role or the owner standard field, typically that's recaptioned in some way in client systems to either be the applicant, the principal investigator, the responsible individual, the contact person, what have you, but it's the individual user who is responsible for that particular record. The next option down is the assigned role. So if a user is assigned to an application, that's done through the contact list on the left-hand side of the record. So if we think about reviewers, program officers, grant administrators, they can all be assigned directly to a record if needs be. And we can, give different access based on those as well. These two blank rows here, these relate to standard fields that are not configured. So we have the internal branch, and then we have the associated additional organization associations. So outside of the main organization that a user is associated with, they can be associated with other organizations, and you can give access to applications from different organizations based on that association. That seems like something for another day, maybe a second webinar on more complex configuration of these permissions. The person role is just the ability to add a second assigned individual with a little bit more access on the specific record. Again, it's a standard field labeled as person. Sometimes this is relabeled in client systems to be the internal staff member that's responsible, or maybe it's a co-applicant or a co-principal investigator, or maybe it's not used. So that really depends on how these systems are configured. And again, we can give them view or add or edit access to people that are assigned with records. Typically, that would be configured, in this particular way. They could view and edit records where they're, the assigned person or the responsible person. And if we think again back to our university example, this particular option, if we were to say view here, this would allow any applicant within the same organization to view applications that have been submitted by users within the same organization. So a typical example here, if we imagine a university, this would allow users in the same university, if it was set like this, to view applications from within their own university. Now, we mightn't want that at all. Maybe you have applicants from the same department competing for funding, in which case you might want to explicitly deny this particular option. So this means that applicants or organization contacts cannot view, explicitly cannot view applications from within their own organization. And again, just like with the user and company security matrix, if we check a deny role, it will remove all of the view and edit options as well that correspond with them. So let's go down to our reviewer role. You'll notice that the reviewer role is considerably different from the organization contact role. They are only allowed to view records that they have been assigned to. So reviewers would be assigned directly to an application form or to a level 2 review activity. And if you want to enable something like split screen, they do need to be given view access only to the application form. Again, you can hide fields on a field by field basis or a status by status basis from these roles. But remember, we are talking about the very top level of security here. And the same is true, if we left organization checked here, the reviewer would be able to see any application that their organization has submitted. So with these kind of options, they are very, very powerful, and they do require some considerable testing before they are configured or modified. The staff role, much like the company and org security matrices, they can view, add, and edit all applications. We haven't set assign, but a typical example would also be assign. And that basically means that they can add users to the contact list. If this wasn't checked, they wouldn't be able to add contacts to the contact list on the left-hand side of a record. And then the system administrator, as with most examples, they have complete access to also delete level 1 activities. And then the last thing is the board member role. So this is a UTA specific role or a UTA role. So they don't have access outside of being assigned to records. This would typically be included in addition to a system-wide role or a system role. And they can only view what they have been explicitly assigned to. They can't interact with any other application within the system. So again, they can only see what they are explicitly assigned to. And the level 2 activity security matrix is again configured in much the same way, with the exception really of the reviewer role. So in this case, we're giving the reviewer the ability to edit what they have been assigned the owner of and also view. But we're also giving them the ability to add new level 2 activities. Maybe from an invitation point of view, you know, you want to allow, I don't know, you know, whatever the reasoning is, maybe you need to create a new level 2 activity here. Maybe the reviewer needs to initiate the configuration. Maybe you have a level 2 activity called, you know, reviewer invoice or something that will allow them to create that level 2 activity and then upload the appropriate invoice. And again, if you note the board member here at the bottom, they can only view what they have been explicitly assigned to. So at this point, these settings, again, as I said, these would all be available across all the different UTAs, application managers, meeting managers, board managers, panel managers, what have you. But we're going to look very, very quickly at the field permission security matrix. And the field permission security matrix is used when we have to configure complex or detailed permissions around a particular field. So where we need to combine roles and statuses, for example. And they are configured again within the UTA security settings, and we have the field permission security matrix. So we start by creating a new one, and we select the record type that we wanted to apply to. And it will apply to all level 1 types at this point within the UTA, so we're taking the application level 1. And what we're doing here is we're given an option to select a status, and this is the status at which the field permission matrix will be applied. So we'll stick with draft, and we will say that the organization can view and edit the particular fields that we're going to apply this to. The reviewer cannot view or edit at draft status. Staff cannot view or edit at draft status, and the system administrator will allow them to view at this particular point. Now, if we imagine we might skip a role here, let's stick with submitted actually. So what we will do is we'll allow view here for the organization contact. We'll allow view for the reviewer because it's been submitted. We'll allow view and edit for the staff, and we'll allow view and edit for system administrator. So now we have this field permission matrix configured for 2 different statuses. If we go to a custom field, so all I've done is preloaded a particular custom field here, and I'm just going to reload my page so that I can get the option. And if I go into permissions and availability, I now have the ability to select the field permission matrix. So once I save this, you'll notice that I've left all of the other permissions blank. So this particular field is now going to fall under the permissions set within the security matrix. So now on that particular field, on the title field, my organization contact will be able to view and edit it in draft mode or in draft status. My reviewer, my staff will not be able to view or edit it at that status, and my system administrator will be able to view it only. And at the submitted status, the title cannot be modified by the organization contact, the applicant, or the reviewer, but it can be modified if needs be by the staff and the system administrator. Now, one thing to bear in mind is if a security matrix is applied to a field, it should be configured for every status. So it's better practice to configure it all in this place than to try and combine status and role specific, or to try and combine these role and application permissions here. It would be better to use one or the other, especially if you're doing it on a field by field basis. Because that's the idea here. It's to accommodate those strange scenarios where you might have maybe an internal comments field that only needs to be modified by a staff member at the under review status, you know, or an additional comments field for an applicant that needs to be modified at the revisions requested status, and not modifiable by anybody else. So it's to handle those kind of complex scenarios. So at this point, folks, that's the end of my brief demonstration. So I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Great, thanks, Greg. If an external user applicant has a dual appointment, like a university and a VA hospital, do they need to manage two separate profiles, or can we link them with a sub-organization or an association?
That's a good question, Lynn. They can have a single profile, and you can use it's the organization associations, so that they can be assigned to multiple users at the same time. And they can also be assigned to multiple organizations in multiple roles. So again, in universities and research examples, we would have users applying as an applicant in one organization. Maybe they're working as a researcher or a reference in another organization.
Could the term user for the second tab of the two matrix grids be viewed by us as the people grid, in that the matrix controls the access to those record types in the system?
Correct, Mark. Exactly. So the user is the language that has been defined within your instance. In my particular example, rather than using people, it was the user language that was being used, but you were dead right.
Are we able to allow certain individuals from an organization to see all applications from that organization, but not allow all users from that org to see all applications? For example, the director of sponsored projects often wants to see all applications.
Yeah, so in that particular scenario, Lynn, I think you need an additional role labeled maybe specifically as the director of sponsored projects. And in that case, you can combine that with other roles that the user may have, and you can give them view permissions to everything. And then the typical applicants or co-applicants within the organization, you can use the security matrix as it is already configured, giving them access to only what they are the owner of.
So it looks like that's all the questions for right now. If anybody does have any follow-up questions after this, so please feel free to reach out to us at businesssolutions@smartsimple.com, because we're happy to hear from you. Yeah, we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, everybody. I do understand the security matrix is quite complex, and there was some chance that some things that I was saying weren't too clear. So as Sarah said,